Well, welcome. Thank you all for being here. I teach at Thomas More College in New Hampshire, and I first met Scott and Mary just a few weeks ago when they asked me to speak at a conference, and I said then that I didn't feel very qualified. And so when they asked me to speak on Chesterton, I said, well, really, you want my husband, but he's about to board a plane from Tel Aviv because he's been on pilgrimage for the last 2 weeks in the Holy Land. So she said, no, we'd really like to have you. So I'm not quite sure why, other than I teach literature. I concentrate on literature and poetry. So my remarks this evening will be a little bit historical, given that the lectures are devoted to World War I. But they'll be historical and cultural with a very pronounced focus on the literary developments of the early 20th century and the post-war period. And also, I decided to contrast and compare or talk about both G.K. Chesterton and Joyce Kilmer. First and foremost, because I actually know more about Kilmer than I know about Chesterton. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, Joseph Pierce, who writes on Lewis and Tolkien, and he's written on the World War I poets, called me up and said, I've been asked to give a talk at the Knights of Columbus Museum on Joyce Kilmer, but I don't really know much about Joyce Kilmer. And I thought, well, I know 3 things about Joyce Kilmer. Joyce is a he, a convert to Catholicism, and he wrote that poem called Trees. That was pretty much all I knew, but I thought, I've got time to figure it out. And so in the intervening months, I did quite a bit of research on Kilmer and really grew to have a very strong affection for his life, his writings, and his legacy, which I think deserve to be more broadly known. And so part of this evening is discharging that labor of love. And so I'd like to begin. Kilmer, we just passed the 101st anniversary of Kilmer's death. He died June 30th, 1918. In France. He was 31. He was at the prime of his career. Like many of the English war poets, left behind a wife and 5 children. And interestingly, for those of you who've read the Narnia books, The Magician's Nephew is dedicated to Kilmer's grandchildren because his son Kenton went on to teach at Catholic University and start a school with his wife called Green Valley, and they had 10 children, and the children loved the Narnia books, and so became correspondents, and many of the letters in Lewis's letters to children are from the Kilmer grandchildren. So there are all these amazing connections. But Kilmer actually wrote very few direct poems that are directly related to World War I. One that I'd like to begin with is called Prayer of a Soldier in France. It is actually not in the collection. When I like to reference a lot of poems, and only the few that I'm going to talk about are in the collection. And it's basically rhyming couplets, and the second line of every rhyming couplet. Do I have it in there? Yes. It is in there. Oh, good. Okay, it's the first poem in there. Thank you. Couldn't remember what I decided to put in and decided to leave out. Okay, the second poem after the Wife of Flanders. Okay, so it's got these nice parenthetical comments that frame into the experience of the soldier. My shoulders ache beneath my pack, lie easier cross upon his back. I march with feet that burn and smart, tread, holy feet, upon my heart. Men shout at me who may not speak, they scourge thy back and smote thy cheek. I may not lift a hand to clear my eyes of salty drops that sear. Then shall my fickle soul forget the agony of bloody sweat? My rifle hand is stiff and numb, from thy pierced palm red rivers come. Lord, thou didst suffer more for me than all the hosts of land and sea. So let me render back again this millionth of thy gift. Amen. So I just wanted to begin with that because it beautifully captures so much of Kilmer's attitude, which is in such stark contradiction to much of what is happening in the culture and in poetry during the time when he lived and was writing. James Joyce, when he published his short story, The Dead, in 1904, the main character, Gabriel Conroy, says, "Ours is a thought-tormented age." And that notion of a thought-tormented age, for how many of you were here for Scott's talk? So last week. I was not, but I know he did talk about Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a poem that, typifies this thought-tormented age. I cannot say just what I mean, and this sort of inability to get outside of one's mind and express oneself in words. And so people frequently speak of the war as kind of the turning point in culture, sort of ushering in this disintegration. And I would say there's a partial truth to that, but the reality is, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is written and published before the outbreak of the war. And in it, we already see these seeds of disintegration, the disintegration of culture, the disintegration of language. There is much already going on in the culture. And so, when William Butler Yeats publishes The Second Coming in 1919 and says, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold," he is reacting, in a sense, to the experience of the war. But he's also giving voice to something that's been growing in the culture for some time. And so that sort of disintegration and that sort of utter, I guess the analogy I would use is total war. So the Germans are thought to have been the first to conduct this method of total war in World War I. And that idea of total war, as one historian has put it, it entailed, quote, "the breakdown of the distinction between soldiers and civilians and the rejection of accepted morality in warfare. The treatment of civilians in Belgium, which is part of the subject of Chesterton's poem, The Wife of Flanders, by the occupying German forces, and the reliance on new methods of warfare, especially the use of gas, but also submarine warfare, were the most important steps in the advent of total war." And one a proponent of the war during the time, one German said, "Better that 1,000 church towers fall than that one German soldier should fall as a result of these towers," because, of course, they started bombing churches and cathedrals. "Let's not have any whining from humanists and aesthetes among ourselves. We have to assert ourselves. Those are such simple truths that it becomes tedious to have to repeat them to people who don't wish to hear." So I guess by analogy, I would suggest that what's happening with modernism and with the new movements in art, and particularly with reference to poetry, is a kind of total war. And it's a total war on language itself. And so that there's this battle raging for the integrity of language. And for the leavening role of poetry in popular culture, not simply poetry as a vehicle of high culture and rarefied sentiments, but a kind of popular poetry. And I would suggest that both Kilmer and Chesterton, as I hope to demonstrate, are advocates of that type of poetry. They're trying to defend and maintain ground for language itself and meaning and order and form in poetry. And, it's worth asking where we ended up. But I think in that battle, Eliot is a very complex, to say the least, a very complex figure. And so I will make some references to Eliot throughout the talk. Now, Kilmer, as I said, lived, wrote, and died keenly aware of and deeply engaged in this battle for the cultural and spiritual threats, which extended well beyond the fields of France. And during his lifetime, his brief lifetime, he lectured frequently. He wrote poetry, but he didn't consider himself first and foremost a poet. He considered himself a journalist. He wrote regularly for the New York Times and other magazines and publications. He edited the Literary Digest. So he was first and foremost a journalist and a lecturer, and secondarily a poet. But in his final lecture, which was given at a now defunct Jesuit college, Campion College, in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, he said this to the graduates. He gave the commencement address. In a sense, all of you will go forth to battle our nation's foes, although you never carry a rifle. For the forces of materialism, spiritual indifference, cynicism are more formidable than any blast of shell or shrapnel, more terrible than an army with banners. So Kilmer thought of himself as defending these things on the fields of France as much as he was defending the freedom of France from invasion, as much as he was defending his own nation. So Chesterton as well thought of himself as deeply engaged in a battle against modernism. He did not fight in the war. His brother, Cecil Chesterton, whom Kilmer knew and dedicated at least one of his poems to, did die in France in 1917. But Chesterton wrote throughout the war years in the London Illustrated News. He wrote several articles in support of the war. And he wrote many poems about the war. These were chiefly published in a 1922 volume called The Ballad of St. Barbara. That's the title poem is the title of the collection, but some of the poems that I'll make reference from are from that collection, which was, of course, published after the war. But he has a poem that you may have heard of. If you haven't, it's not in the handout, but I would like to read it. And it, in Chesterton's typically very humorous vein, sort of critiques the modern poet for his assault on language, and particularly his assault on metaphor. And if you remember, you know, the image that we get in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock of the night sky. What is the night sky compared to? Does anybody remember? To a patient etherized upon a table, which is not a very pleasant image. And the other famous modernist poem is probably Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro, which has this sort of haiku-type quality. It's the apparition of those faces, petals on a wet black bough. So this notion of the modernist poets of sort of reflecting the disintegration in their choice of metaphors themselves, these kind of really violent, jarring metaphors that the modernist poets were partial to, was something that most traditionally trained poets, most of those recoiled against, because it really does get at the heart of what it means to communicate through language. I mean, we do, metaphor posits that reality is intelligible. When we can say that something is like something else in one aspect only, then we have to do the mental work to determine and to think through what is the what is the relationship between these two things? So, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. Not in every aspect. In what aspect? And so it does ask that you see the integration of reality, that you see reality as intelligible and as ordered. And so this assault on figurative language was something that both Kilmer and Chesterton were deeply distressed by, as well as the breakdown of form. Because so much of poetry, and I might use the chalkboard for those of us who are not, as I was when I was a young literature student, not really attentive to the relationship between form and meaning in poetry, it really is just amazing what great poets do with the language and what the language is capable of. And so I'll just read to you this poem called To a Modern Poet. Well, what about it? I am sorry you have a green pain gnawing your brain away. I suppose quite a lot of it is gnawed away by this time. I did not give you a green pain, or even a gray powder. It is rather you, so winged, so vortical, who give me a pain. When I have a pain, I never notice the color. But I am very unobservant. I cannot say I ever noticed that the pillar box was like a baby skinned alive and screaming. I have not a poet's eye which can see beauty everywhere. Now you mention it, of course the sky is like a large mouth shown to a dentist. And I never noticed a little thing like that. But I can't help wishing you got more fun out of it. You seem to have taken quite a dislike to things. They seem to make you jump and double up unexpectedly. And when you write like other poets on subjects not entirely novel, such as, for instance, the sea, it is mostly about seasickness. As you say, it is the new movement, the emetic ecstasy. And for those of you who don't know what emetic means, I had to look it up, I admit. Does anybody know what it means? It means inducing vomiting. So this is Chesterton's sort of response to the modernist project. And I think that it shows in the types of poems both poets wrote on the war. And so I'd like to begin by sort of moving into those. I started with a little subheading that said Kilmer, champion of the ordinary. And when I got to Chesterton, I had started the subheading that said Chesterton, champion of the ordinary. And I thought, oh, there's a certain consonance of theme here. But it's true. When Joyce Kilmer was killed by a sniper's bullet on the 30th of June in 1918, just 4 months before the war ended, the nation mourned the loss of the most popular Catholic poet then living. He was called the Catholic Laureate of America. He was referred to as the American Chesterton. The tributes that came out were prolific, and his funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York, was massive. 10 times thrice happy is he, rarest of men, who like Kilmer never penned a line or said a word or did a deed that can arise to bring confusion to those who love him. The Literary Digest said, "The world is the poorer for the loss of a very gallant gentleman and a poet who never wrote a line that was not pure and sweet and clean." Catherine Bergy said of his war poems shortly after his death, quote, "All are expressions of something beautiful. All stand excellent chance of being read a century after the war is over." And actually in France, last summer, in commemoration of World War II, the Rainbow Division went over, and his poem, Rouge Bouquet, was read by the American commander. Rouge Bouquet is a poem that commemorates about 20 or so of Kilmer's fellow soldiers who were trapped, buried alive when their dugout was shelled. And he wrote it then, and it was read by the Catholic chaplain to the regiment that Kilmer was in, Father Francis Duffy, a famous chaplain. His statue is in New York, and he read it to commemorate those soldiers, and he also read it after Kilmer was killed. After his death, nearly a decade after his death, in the pages of the New York Times, a columnist said, "He has taken his place in literature and in history. Everything connected with him becomes not only of interest, but essential to the understanding of him." And a generation later, writers were still saying, "Joyce Kilmer has enshrined his name in the hearts of his countrymen. His life has served as an inspiration for millions of young Americans." And I think particularly among Catholics, it's rather shameful that Kilmer is so little known today, because of his writings, but also because of his life. And like I said, he wrote only a handful of war poems, just the briefest details about his life. He was born in 1886. He attended Rutgers and then graduated from Columbia. As I mentioned, he and his wife had 5 children. Their daughter Rose was stricken with polio and later died shortly before he was deployed. And shortly after his daughter's diagnosis, he and his wife converted to Catholicism. He was, as I said, a frequent lecturer, writer, and he was a very hard worker. He didn't type, but he could dictate 4,000 to 5,000 words an hour, which is quite impressive. And so he published many writings during his brief life, and essays, a couple of plays. He has essays on Chesterton, on many on Belloc, on many well-known writers of his day that are definitely worth reading, and of course, sadly, out of print. And of course, his poetry became widely known when Trees was published in 1913. And I did put Trees on the back of, I'm sure many of you, had anybody ever memorize it? Yes. Once Upon a Time. It's just couplets of iambic tetrameter, sort of 8-syllable lines. It's very, the sentiments are very simple. "I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree." So it's interesting because I had a group of summer students last summer at the college and high schoolers, and I asked them their assignment was to come up with an example of figurative language. They had to look at something in nature and liken it to something else. And this was actually a terrifying assignment. I don't think in our world, I think it actually in our world of autonomy and dissociation and distraction, we don't actually think about likenesses. We think a lot about differences, but we actually don't think about the relationship between things and the implications of those relationships. And I'd say about 2/3 of the students came back and they said, the limbs of the tree look like arms that are outstretched. And I saw one limb, one student said, and it didn't have any leaves, and it looked like a finger pointing at God. And I thought, Kilmer may be simple and predictable, but he's definitely expressing something very, as Chesterton would say, it's so obvious we can't recognize it. We've lost our capacity to notice those things. And I'm all for, playfully imitating certain poems. And certainly Trees has had many imitators over the years. Some of them are quite funny. I don't know if any of you have heard of these parodies. Ogden Nash, who's very funny poet, obviously. I think that I shall never see a billboard lovely as a tree. Indeed, unless the billboards fall, I'll never see a tree at all. And Thomas Merton, I love this, because the Trappists at Gethsemane were not making fruitcakes at this period, they were making cheese. So he says, I think that we should never free such lively assets as our cheese. The sucker's hungry mouth is pressed against the cheese's caraway breast. Poems are not but warmed up breeze. Dollars are made by Trappist cheese. So I like having fun with that sort of thing. But I do have to say that one of the few ways in which Kilmer is memorialized every year is, to me, very distressing. And that's his alma mater, Columbia University, has a bad poetry contest every year. And it's Joyce Kilmer was the head of this Philolexian club when he was there. And so the Philolexian club, which is still around, has the Joyce Kilmer Bad Poetry Contest every year, which, if it were all fun and games and parodies, might be acceptable. But I've looked online and I tell you all not to do that because the poems are positively foul. They're really reprehensible. And so it just, I think, is, like I said, distressing. And I actually wrote, the English faculty never got a response at Columbia University asking if they were doing anything for the 100th anniversary of his death other than mocking him with a bad poetry contest. And they never responded. So anyway, I don't wish to argue that Kilmer was a great poet. I don't think he was. But he was a good poet. And in his day, and well beyond his day, he was an immensely popular poet. And he quite intentionally wrote commonplace poetry for commonplace people. And I think it's safe to say that in the intervening century, that type of poetry has disappeared. If you do, as I have done, a YouTube search for any of Kilmer's poems, you will see countless videos of people in their 70s and 80s, people in nursing homes, people whose grandchildren are videotaping them, and they can recite word for word many of Kilmer's poems. The House with Nobody in It, Dave Lilly. When I gave a talk at, and I have someone who was there, at the Knights of Columbus Museum, afterwards this gentleman who had driven up from Kentucky to New Haven, Connecticut, because he loved Kilmer so much as a child. And he was an elderly man, and he entertained my children and I for a length of time, just reciting Kilmer's poetry from memory. And I think that's, pretty impressive and worth keeping in mind when we think about, where we've come as a culture. And Kilmer knew that he was a mediocre poet. He said, the Catholic faith is such a thing that I would rather write moderately well about it than magnificently well about anything else. And he could have very easily gone in a different direction. He lived and wrote in New York in the early 20th century. If you look at his letters to his mother prior to his conversion in 1913, he's dining out at all the fashionable restaurants with all the fashionable artists, with, sculptors and artists and composers. He's writing to his mother, I'm to start translating a Russian play, The Cherry Garden, with a friend of mine who's an exiled revolutionist. Presumably that's Chekhov's, Cherry Orchard. Do you hear much of Ezra Pound's work in England? He's a young American poet resident in London. I have read his 2 books, which have made some sensation over here. But these are balanced by these sorts of things. I just love seeing, what people were reading, and they're just published, I've bought a new book by Kenneth Grahame called The Wind in the Willows. By all means, read Chesterton's latest novel, Man Alive. It's a very delightful book. Do you remember those essays of Chesterton I got you recently, don't you? So I think he had some very leavening influences in his reading tastes and some, difficult experiences in his life, which proved to be a blessing that drew him closer to God and further away from the modernist tendencies that he initially espoused. They also, I think over time, well, before I talk about his couple of war poems, I just want to just give you little snippets about the range of poems that he wrote. In The Snowman in the Yard, he contrasts his own chaotic, unkempt house full of children running all over the yard, playing in the snow, with that of his wealthy neighbors, whose home is perfectly manicured, very spacious. The snow is all piled neatly, but it's empty. And he says, "But I have something no architect or gardener ever made, a thing that is shaped by the busy touch of little mittened hands. And the judge would give up his lonely estate where the level snow is laid, for the tiny house with the trampled yard, the yard where the snowman stands." So again, they're simple and they are sentimental. But, Flanier O'Connor said that tenderness without the source of tenderness, which is Christ, ends in terror. But that doesn't mean that tenderness is bad in and of itself. And there is a place for a healthy sentiment. And I think it's precisely in this sort of popular poetry that children would have been reading. And he has a poem called Delicatessen. He was once given a challenge by an office mate who said, "There are just some inherently unpoetic topics." And Kilmer said, "Like what?" And he said, "Like that deli around the corner. You can't write a poem about a deli." And Chesterton Kilmer being who he was, thought, well, I can. And so he wrote this poem that really it's very Chestertonian. It's sort of a paean to the small business owner. He decks his window artfully, he haggles over paltry sums. In this strained field his war must be, and by such blows his triumph comes. The man has home and child and wife, and battle set for every day. This man has God and love and life. These stand, all else shall pass away. O carpenter of Nazareth, whose mother was a village maid, shall we thy children blow our breath in scorn on humble trade? Have pity on our foolishness, and give us eyes that we may see, beneath the shopman's clumsy dress, the splendor of humanity. So, and I would suggest again that Kilmer's sort of celebration of these simple pleasures was really forged in his own family experiences, in the birth of his children, in the suffering of his children, in his own life. So I just want to read one poem by Kilmer that's in the little handout that is one of his war poems, because it's very similar to other, are any of you familiar with the British war poets like Wilfred Owens and Siegfried Sassoon and Rupert Brooke? So there's a kind of, again, there's a tension in that war poetry. There's a sort of nostalgia for what you don't have, and then there's a sort of despair over what has happened to you. And it really is instructive to see the turn that certain poets take and why they take that turn. Kilmer had ample reason to take the turn toward despair in the experiences that he had during the war, what he witnessed. He enlisted in this regiment, the Fighting 69th, which was well known as the kind of average Joe Irish regiment. And he wasn't Irish, and he was sort of waspy, and he specifically wanted to be in that regiment because he wanted to be with the average Joes. And of course, everybody kept trying to get him desk jobs because he was a famous writer, and they wanted him to be a journalist and chronicle the war, and he wanted to serve. And so he kept irritating everybody by, asking for these more dangerous missions and putting himself forward. And he said multiple times, and he passed up advancements. He said, "I'd rather be a sergeant in the 69th than a lieutenant in any other division." And so he remained a sergeant in the Fighting 69th. It's worth discussing, since he was a family man with 5 children, why he felt so compelled to put himself so directly in harm's way. There were many who were trying to persuade him not to, including Catholic priest friends, but he really had this deep desire to serve God and his country in that way. So this poem, Mirage du Cantonnement, is basically one of these poems that is written. So a mirage, of course, is something that's an illusion, and cantonment in American English is basically a military garrison. So this poem is basically, at least as I read it, someone who's, in the military garrison, which if you've ever seen, they're sort of imagining a time of peace and beauty and tranquility that is, at this moment in time, a mirage. Many laughing ladies, leisurely and wise, low, rich voice, delicate, gay cries, tea in fragile china cups, ices, macaroons, Sheraton and Hepplewhite, and old thin spoons. Rather dim paintings on very high walls, windows showing lawns whereon the sunlight falls, pink and silver gardens, and broad, kind trees, and fountains scattering rainbows at the whim of a breeze. Fragrance, mirth, and gentleness, a summer day, in a world that has forgotten everything but play. Isn't that sweet? And I like to think about that in light of, again, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. In the halls, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo, where there's just this incredible heaviness and an ennui, and culture is something oppressive, and art is something oppressive. And, I think Kilmer is invoking things that have beauty, that still can have some meaning. And, I'm not suggesting that the age wasn't rife with oppressiveness and ennui, but giving what it's worth reflecting. What is the end game of expressing that that kind of self-expression in poetry, and forgetting play, as I would suggest. There's not really. There's some verbal play, obviously, in that poem of Eliot's, but not the kind of play that I think Kilmer's talking about here. I think it's more like, and I did this. This is another one of my favorite. It's not really a war poem. It's written in 1914, before the war breaks out, but it gains a kind of poignancy when Edward Thomas is killed in the war, and it's published in 1917. And there's a sense in which the memory of something beautiful is it's dim, it's a mirage, but it's still there. It still has some integrity. So I won't read that in the interest of time, but it's just healthy to, even when those things, as they must have to the soldiers, seem like another world, seem so distant, so remote, and so, in some respects, alien, yet they're so familiar. And it really bothered Kilmer when his wife would write, and she thought she was commiserating, talking about rationing, talking about, I'm eating this kind of in solidarity. And he said, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear that you're enjoying life, that you're eating great food, because that's what I'm fighting for, to preserve that life. And so there is a kind of way in which his poetry kind of reflects that. Now, he initially was opposed to the war for a variety of reasons. He began as a pacifist, and in his early days was a little bit of a radical. But then something happened on May, I believe it was May 7th in 1915. And his mother was British, so he would often go over to England with her. And that was the sinking of the Lusitania by the Germans. And again, it was this idea of total war, that all these civilians had been innocently killed. And he wrote a poem. He wrote it in a single morning, and it was called The White Ships and the Red. And The white ships are ships that have perished throughout the ages directly through war or through accident. So there's a Spanish galleon, there's the Titanic, and they meet this red ship, which is innocent, and it's the Lusitania. And the Lusitania speaks to these other ships. And it's really quite a Jeremiah. It has that sort of Old Testament feel. But never crashing iceberg, nor honest shot of foe, nor hidden reef has sent me the way that I must go. My wound that stains the waters, my blood that is like flame, bear witness to a loathly deed, a deed without a name. My wrong cries out for vengeance. The blow that sent me here was aimed in hell. My dying scream has reached Jehovah's ear. So his view on the war changed in that moment. And then he says, we are peacemakers, we soldiers of the 69th. We're risking our lives to bring back peace to the simple, generous, gay, pious people of France. They are an invaded people, and invaded people are always right. So I'll just end the little part on Kilmer. I'll come back to him, but I brought these two. The Knights of Columbus nicely printed these out, and they let me take them home. This is his graduation picture from Columbia, and this is Kilmer when he enlisted and attempted to grow facial hair. But I just love this picture because he just looks so sweet. And you can see there's a kind of sweetness to him. And it was very interesting because when I was reading a physical description of him, it put me in mind immediately of another description of a famous poet that I knew of. And so everybody who met him just described his intensity, his energy, his joy, he was just utterly sanguine. And his biographer, who was a close friend and not an agnostic, said he was so unlike all other young men anyone had ever seen walking about, so much brighter and purer, or some indescribable thing that he did not seem altogether real. And one friend described him as medium height, a bit plump, with thick, dark, reddish-brown hair and a childlike face. But his eyes were his most remarkable feature. They were of the unusual color of red, and they had a most peculiar quality, which I can only inadequately suggest by saying that they literally glowed. It actually seemed as if there were a fire behind them, not a leaping and hissing fire, but a steady and unquenchable flame, which appeared to suffuse the whole eyeball with a brooding light. And that reminded me of when Sir Walter Scott was 15 and he met Robert Burns. He said, the eye alone indicated the poetical character and temperament. It was large and of a dark cast and literally glowed when he spoke with feeling or interest. I never saw such another eye in a human head, though I have seen the most distinguished men of my time. So I don't know if his friend was just borrowing from Sir Walter Scott in his description, or if there's something about the shared intensity of their eyes. But I want to, let me see what time we're at. I'm going to take a sip of water if that's okay. Is everybody holding up okay in the heat? No one needs to get up and move around? Okay. I want to turn to Chesterton now and similarly describe his love of the commonplace, his defense of the ordinary things, and his defense of a kind of traditional approach to poetic composition. Chesterton is, I think, the superior poet. I think he gave a lot more thought to diversity of forms, but I also think he is a little bit less optimistic, actually, or hopeful than Kilmer, and I'm sure he had good reason to be during that time period. There were a couple of expressions that were common during World War I, and there were many who were opposed to the war. Chesterton even though he wrote some of his war poems are deeply critical, they are not critical of the war, and they are not critical of the soldiers. They're critical of the power players and the way that they're behaving and their life and their actions and their decisions and their impact on others who are innocent. He takes exception to those who would oppose, praying to God in battle, as if God was pro-war. And he says the only just war is in some way, by definition, a holy war. And so he says the cheapest and most childish of all the taunts of the pacifists is, I think, the sneer at belligerents for appealing to the God of battles. It is ludicrously illogical, for we obviously have no right to kill for victory, save when we have a right to pray for it. If a war is not a holy war, it is an unholy one, a massacre. So there was no, distinction for that for Chesterton. He also did not like the expression "the war to end all wars," or Wilson's "we need to make America safe for democracy," because he thought that those were foolishly optimistic, as if you could end war. And I cannot see how we can literally end war unless we can end will. I cannot think that war will ever be utterly impossible. And I say so not because I am what these people call a militarist, but rather because I am a revolutionist. Absolutely to forbid fighting is to forbid what our fathers called, quote, the sacred right of insurrection. Against some decisions, no self-respecting men can be prevented from appealing to fortune and to death. There are two poems, short poems, that he wrote in this 1922 volume that sort of get at what I would suggest. They don't express his hatred of the Germans or his anger at their injustice. And these are both about memorials for soldiers. So the first one is called Elegy in a Country Churchyard, and it's a conscious, play on Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, although it's much shorter. And both of these poems are written in a kind of ballad meter. And the ballad meter is very simple in structure. It's very good for narrative. It's very predictable. It's also called common meter because it's what most hymns are written in. It's if you know meter at all, it's 8-6-8-6. It's lines of iambic tetrameter and then iambic trimeter, and has a very simple rhyme scheme, but it fits very well for both of these poems. The men that worked for England, they have their graves at home, and birds and bees of England about the cross can roam. But they that fought for England, following a falling star, alas, alas for England, they have their graves afar. And they that rule in England, in stately conclave met, alas, alas for England, they have no graves as yet. So it's pretty harsh. So it's basically, lamenting that, what is the poem? There's the famous Rupert Brooke poem about being buried in France, and there is some corner that is forever England. It's a beautiful poem about having to be buried away from your homeland, and the sort of it's just doesn't seem right. There's just something not right about it. The other is called For a War Memorial. Suggested inscription, probably not suggested by the committee. That's the sort of subtitle. The hucksters haggle in the mart, the cars and carts go by, senates and schools go droning on, for dead things cannot die. A storm stooped on the place of tombs with bolts to blast and rive, but these be names of many men the lightning found alive. If users rule and rights decay and visions view once more, great Carthage, like a golden shell, gape hollow on the shore. Still to the last of crumbling time, upon this stone be read, how many men of England died to prove they were not dead. So, of course, this poem is premised upon one of these Chestertonian paradoxes, right? That those who are truly alive are the soldiers who died for their country, and the dead cannot die. Those are the hucksters that haggle in the mart, the senates and schools, the decision makers, the policy makers. So there is a real undercurrent of frustration and anger in, not simply combating the enemy without, but confronting the dragon within England itself. And that's a common theme of Chesterton's poems, the sort of corruption of English society by materialism and commercialism and industrialism. So the poem that I have in this anthology, The Wife of Flanders, is a bit of an exception. The hero is not a valorous English soldier. It's a simple peasant wife in Belgium whose farm has been razed by the Germans, whose sons have been murdered by the Germans. Just trying to find my copy so I can read it to you. Low and brown barns, thatched and repatched and tattered, where I had 7 sons until today. A little hill of hay your spur has scattered. This is not Paris. You have lost the way. You, staring at your sword to find it brittle, surprised at the surprise that was your plan. Who, shaking and breaking barriers not a little, find nevermore the death door of Sedan. Must I for more than carnage call you claimant? Paying you a penny for each son you slay? Man, the whole globe in gold were no repayment for what you have lost. And how shall I repay? What is the price of that red spark that caught me from a kind farm that never had a name? What is the price of that dead man they brought me, for other dead men do not look the same? How should I pay for one poor graven steeple whereon you shattered what you shall not know? How should I pay you, miserable people? How should I pay you everything you owe? Unhappy, can I give you back your honor? Though I forgave, would any man forget? While all the great green land has trampled on her the treason and terror of the night we met. Not any more in vengeance or in pardon an old wife bargains for a bean that's hers. You have no word to break, no heart to harden. Ride on and prosper. You have lost your spurs. So, that is, I think, a very powerful poem, and I think casting it from the voice of the wife herself allows Chesterton to express something incredibly poignant, and he does it. It's a scene of utter destruction. It's a scene where, it's a pietà. It's a mother who's been brought her own dead child, and yet the poet doesn't have to do violence to language and do violence to form to express the outrage of the mother, the injustice of the situation, the utter absence of conscience, and the way in which the soldier is really beyond, at this point in Chesterton's mind, beyond the reach of mercy. That to me is the most striking feature of this poem, is the way in which the irony of that line, ride on and prosper. I don't have vengeance. I don't have pardon. There is a kind of, it's not a numbness in the wife at all. And in fact, I would suggest that, again, the connection between form and meaning is not lost on any great poet, and Chesterton really approaches greatness in many of his poems. If you notice, most of these lines, many of them are just clean iambic pentameter. But there's something interesting in every single stanza that I think reflects the two positions of the soldier and the wife. And that is the endings of the lines, which in a normal line of iambic pentameter, you would end on a stressed syllable. It's da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. When I do count the clock that tells the time. It has a regularity to it. And we actually call this, because you end on a stressed syllable, that's called a strong ending. That's also called a masculine ending. And what you have in this poem in every single stanza are two rhyming lines where you have that strong masculine ending. But then there are two lines in every single stanza that don't have that, right? Tattered, scattered, brittle, little, claimant, payment, caught me, brought me, steeple, people. They all reverse the order of the syllables. And, sorry ladies, we call that a feminine ending and a weak ending. And I think your ear is meant to hear the disjunction between the strength of the wife of Flanders, who's the poor peasant wife. She's the strong one because she is the one who's been wronged, and the weak effeminacy, impotency of the German soldier who's basically burned her farm and killed her sons. So there's this, beautiful way in which Chesterton juxtaposes that, and the ear hears that, and it contributes to the meaning, whether consciously or unconsciously. If you have a well-trained ear, and you don't even need a well-trained ear. All you need to do is listen, and you can hear that in the poem. The poem also has, the use of the pronouns, the juxtaposition. When we first hear, I have to repay you for what, for each son you slay, I have to repay you for what you have lost. So it's not what she has lost, which is tremendous. But she says, I can't repay you for what you have lost. You, and she initially means the soldier who's kicked a little bit of hay with his spur. But then by the time we get to the fourth stanza, it's, how should I pay you, miserable people? And there it's just expanded to the entire German race, really, because you have this guilt on your hands, and you can't repay that. And in a way, she's beyond feeling sorry for them that they can't repay that debt. So it has this kind of power, in part because of the sentiment, but it works so well with what's going on in the poetry. If you think about that line, man, the whole globe in gold were no repayment for what you have lost. And you think of that assonance there, right? And assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. What vowel sound is being repeated there? Oh. Oh, which, as Robert Frost said, can be as short as shock, surprise, or as long as protracted agony. That's the most poetic, I think, of all vowel sounds, is O. The whole globe in gold were no repayment. And the O, if you think about, Shakespeare's use of O, right? It's hollow. It's nothing. So there's this beautiful way in which Chesterton is kind of really, you can't separate the form from the meaning in a well-crafted poem. And that's part of my sort of argument against, the cultural carnage, the poetic carnage that it was happening at the same time and in tandem with, and in part as a reaction to, and in part contributing to the war. So, and then this notion of, what is this, you have lost your spurs? Does anybody know what that is referring to? What does that mean? I'm thinking of medieval history. What does that mean if you've lost your spurs?
You can't hurt me anymore. You can't hurt the horse anymore if you don't have your spurs. It's like you've lost your power.
Okay, you've lost your power. But if you know anything about medieval knighthood, that was the ceremony of being stripped of your knighthood. You were publicly had your spurs removed, and you were publicly degraded as a knight. And losing your spurs meant, your loss of identity, really, because you were no longer a knight. So that line is consciously invoking chivalry is dead. Chivalry is dead. And that is, you may think, okay, 1910s, surely, we know chivalry is dead. But actually, chivalry is all over certain discussions about the war. There were, Chesterton wrote a response to an article in The Nation that was called on chivalry and war, and it talked about World War I and the death of chivalry. And Chesterton opposed that and said, no, there are instances of chivalry and war still. He actually appealed to the American Civil War as an instance of it, and he talks about how that kind of modern military courtesy, he says, several of them, and this means the side of the South in the Civil War, redeemed the rather cynical politics of Grant and gave a glamour like that of Galahad to the greatness of Robert E. Lee. And there were arguments by the Germans, actually, when they were debating the use of gas. The Crown Prince Ruprecht said, we can't do this, it's unchivalrous. Of Bavaria, of course, and he was overruled, of course. And, a British observer said, actually, the British soldiers who are being gassed are actually more chivalrous than the medieval knight, because they have the severity of the threat is so much greater. With use by the Germans of poison gas, the war takes a more bitter turn, and horror follows horror until the soldier of civilization has to rise to a height of courage, putting all together in the shade the knight of old, who went out to fight loathly dragons which breathed fire and mephitic vapors. How more splendid than that of any beplumed caparisoned soldier of old is his courage as he rides or squats in mud or dust, swathed in his chemical bandages, so that all human likeness is lost, awaiting not only shot and shell and steel, but asphyxiating gas, lacrimatory gas, stink gas, and other instruments of German warfare. And I think one historian has summed it up very nicely. For the Germans, this was a war to change the world. For the British, this was a war to preserve a world. The Germans were propelled by a vision, the British by a legacy. And so I just think that both Chesterton and Kilmer are engaged in that battle to preserve a world, not to end a world or change a world or usher in something new. And if you'll indulge me for just a few more minutes, I might just, we can take a break. If you would you prefer to take a short break? Okay, just maybe 10 more minutes? Okay. So I want to come back around to Eliot, because I view Eliot as a very difficult figure in this battle, and a rather conflicting figure. So he has a series of lectures after Strange Gods that he publishes in 1934, so this is well after the war. And he addresses the charge that his poetic modernism and critical traditionalism are at odds with each other. So Eliot, of course, brought us out from the drawing room into the wasteland, and then in the four quartets back into the rose garden. But it's arguable that he left a generation of poets stuck in the wasteland, and many are still there and have never come out of it. And so Eliot deeply believed that the fragmentation of his verse was necessary given the historical situation in which the world found itself in the early 20th century. His friend and fellow humanist, Christian humanist Paul Elmer More expressed concern that there was this poetic modernism and yet this critical traditionalism. And Eliot responds, "My friend Dr. Paul Elmer More is not the first critic to call attention to an apparent incoherence between my verse and my critical prose, though he is the first whose perplexity on this account has caused me distress. It would appear that while I maintain the most correct opinions in my criticism, I do nothing but violate them in my verse, and thus appear in a double, if not double-faced role. I feel no shame in this matter." And then Eliot proceeds to make a distinction between the ideal of poetry and the actuality, and suggests that because of the historical circumstances, even though he acknowledges that classical approach, that form in poetry is the ideal, that he could not have written any other way. And he basically carves out that at this present moment, because of what we're going through in the culture, there has to be some exemption from the traditional forms. Quote, "In an age like the present, it could only be poetry of the very greatest rank that could be genuinely what Dr. More would be obliged to call classical. Poets of lower ability, that is all but such a half a dozen perhaps in the world's history, could only be classical by being pseudo-classical, by being unfaithful and dishonest to their experience." So that's right, there's only been 6, maybe not even, great poets in all of world history. "It is too much to expect any literary artist at the present time to be a model of orthodoxy. It is not to be demanded now." So he basically says, it's too much. I can't do it. Chesterton didn't feel that way. Kilmer didn't feel that way. And it's hard not to think that Eliot is sort of boxing himself into a bit of a culturally deterministic view there, that, I wouldn't argue for the utter freedom of the artist from the time in which he lives, and certainly Kilmer and Chesterton are operating within their time period, but to suggest that the artist is bound by his historical conditions in what he can say and do with language is, I think, very limiting. And certainly I don't think any of our great poets would have thought so. I certainly don't think Shakespeare would have. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with a man named Richard Weaver. Richard Weaver wrote a book called Ideas of Consequences. He was a rhetorician at the University of Chicago, and again, a great defender of tradition. The essay from which this quotation is taken is, or the anthology is an anthology of essays called In Defense of Tradition. And Weaver was a devotee of Eliot, and he basically parrots the same thing Eliot says. "No poet today can get a hearing among serious readers of poetry unless his work somehow reflects the torturing experiences with the resulting complexity of attitude which distinguish our age. The world turmoil cannot fail to bring with it so wide a loss of order that no art today can bear to speak simply in terms of beauty and affirmation." So that not only can you not simply speak of beauty and affirmation, but that that the form itself has to be demolished. And I hope that distinction, I've made that distinction clear, because certainly that's the move toward free verse. The move toward free verse only makes sense, first of all, if you have form in verse. Otherwise, there's nothing that you're rebelling against. And you can't see what great freedoms you've taken if you don't know, the form that you're beginning with. And certainly, no great poet thought of form as restricting. No great poet. Shakespeare... Shakespeare has, I don't think there's an eraser here, so I'm going to have to use my hand or something. In Shakespeare's early plays, they're rhyming. They rhyme quite a bit more than the later plays. And Shakespeare understood the potential, thank you, for blank verse, rather than rhyme verse. And that was somewhat innovative, right? But it wasn't, he didn't break the form. One of my favorite modern poets just lived and wrote just up the road from here, Richard Wilbur. He talks about when he writes sonnets that he threatens the form. But he doesn't, the form isn't dissolved, it isn't disintegrated. And really, you have to have that register to see how the artist is really taking advantage of the potentials of the form to convey their meaning. So, you have that line, the basic register of the iambic pentameter. When I do count the clock that tells the time. My mistress with a monster is in love. That's just a simple line of blank verse. But when Richard III tells us, now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York, we pay attention because that first syllable is not where it should be in a line of blank verse. Now is the winter of our discontent. When Lear says never, 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 and he wouldn't say it that way, that was horrible, but just, it's not simply the repetition, but it's the inversion of those syllables. Instead of da 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 da, we have da 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 da. It's jarring to the ear. It's the difference between the friendly cow all red and white I love with all my heart. She gives me cream with all her might to eat with apple tart. And by the shores of Gitche Gumi, by the shining Briggsy waters. You just reverse those syllables and you have an entirely different world, register in which to work. And one suits and one doesn't. When Hamlet says, to be or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet, ends the first several lines of that soliloquy with weak endings. Hamlet is indecisive, and it's appropriate that he's using weak endings to convey, should I exist or not? I just think that in abandoning that, you've cut verse, you've cut language off from, a huge, it's incredible capacity for meaning. And it's not simply just a robotic, mathematical order. Robert Frost likened poetry without rhyme or meter to playing tennis with the net down. And playing tennis with the net down. I feel like, the modernist project is like playing tennis without balls and rackets. I just think that you just don't have any equipment. And I just think that there's a kind of self-indulgence in the attitude that says that the utter disintegration of the age required that we break down verse form, required that language was emptied out of meaning. Suddenly language had no meaning. and I cannot say just what I mean. You know, these kinds of expressions that used to be applied to truly ineffable things, you know, the mysteries of our faith, are applied to, you know, the pain and turmoil of the human psyche. And I don't mean to belittle the anguish of the age. I'm not suggesting that. All I'm saying is it didn't work its way out by abandoning form and order and structure. And Chesterton has much to say on this that is so withering and wise when he talks about free verse. And he calls it the slavery of free verse. With this or that particular metrical form or unmetrical formlessness, I might be content or not as it achieves some particular effect or not, but the whole general tendency, regarded as an emancipation, seems to me more or less of an enslavement. It seems founded on one subconscious idea that talk is freer than verse, and that verse therefore should claim the freedom of talk. But talk, especially in our time, is not free at all. It is tripped up by trivialities, tamed by conventions, loaded with dead words, thwarted by 1,000 meaningless things. It does not liberate the soul so much when a man can say, "You always look so nice," as when he can say, "But your eternal summer shall not fade." The first is an awkward and constrained sentence ending with the weakest word ever used, or rather misused, by man. The second is like the gesture of a giant or the sweeping flight of an archangel. It has the very rush of liberty. I wish I could have written those lines. I do not think it an improvement that the inner spirit itself should grow more external and more dull. I have always had the fancy that if a man were really free, he would talk in rhythm and even in rhyme. It is certain that words such as birds and sweet, which are as plain as fish or stone, can be combined in such a miracle as bare runed choirs where late the sweet birds sang. So far as I can follow my own feelings, the meter and fall of the feet, even the rhyme and place in the sonnet, have a great deal to do with producing such an effect. I do not say that there is no other way of producing such an effect. I only ask, not without longing, where else in this wide and weary time is it produced? So I want to end first with a tribute to Kilmer. When I gave this talk at the Knights of Columbus Museum, I had published an article on Kilmer, and I received an amazing email from this doctor in Maryland who's wrote to me of his father's love for Kilmer. And I think this shows so there are poets today writing with form. You know, Robert Frost in the 20th century, Richard Wilbur, more recently Dana Gioia and James Matthew Wilson. So I do think that the time is ripe for a renaissance of that kind of integrity of language. And I think Kilmer has a role to play in that, and so does Chesterton. But I think Kilmer, being an American and being so deep in his faith, is a great model for a kind of simple poetry. That's a good place to start. My father, now 14 years in the grave, had a great love for Kilmer. This is much more of a tribute than you realize, since my father, though thoroughly realistic and pragmatic, tone deaf, completely blind to art in all its many forms, once described as a cultural nothing by his siblings, had not a poetic bone in his body. Nevertheless, in the twilight of his 80 years, even with a memory impaired by normal pressure hydrocephalus, he could recite trees in full. Part of his love for Kilmer, I think, stemmed from his own service in the South Pacific during World War II, which seared and marked him in ways that those of us who have never been to war can only guess at. He was part of the occupation army of Japan after the war and visited both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I remember him describing for me, with just a barely observed hint of deeply suppressed horror, the shadows of human beings seared on buildings, the only legacy left of those who were vaporized by the nuclear blasts. So here is a man for whom this simple poetry had meaning. And I just would like to end because, when I took on this task and I read that for every great idea he had, Kilmer gave a talk, wrote an essay, and wrote a poem, I thought, well, I'm going to write a poem for Kilmer. And so I wrote a poem. So I'm just going to end by reading this poem, which I had never read The Wife of Flanders when I wrote this poem. So reading The Wife of Flanders and seeing that Chesterton put it in the perspective of the wife speaking to the German and the kind of almost cold cutting off of the German made me think of my effort in a different light. The poem is I have copies because if you want to look at the form, you can. I'm not a very good poet. I never write poems. I hadn't written a poem in many, many years, although I do teach my students to write poems. I think it's very important. When we learn the height of Latin composition is being able to write Latin verse. You really don't get inside of a language until you try to write poetry in it. And I feel like, especially our own native tongue, we just learn so much when we attempt to submit our thoughts to the discipline of form. So this poem is called Testimony of a German Sniper for Sergeant Joyce Kilmer, 1918 to 2018. I shot a man in France today. Now I am numb and cannot pray. We chose our weapons. Yours were delight, mirth, that grating goodness everyone adored. Mine, a Mausergewehr 98, a single bullet straight through your sweet skull. What folly had brought us to that moment? And how was I to know what I had killed? The corner deli, Main Street, the snowman in the yard. You made it sound so simple, so pure, so lovely, like a blue mantle gently shrouding a bent and broken world. There was something insufferable in all that goodness, all that regularity of line and rhyme and rhythm, all that talk of the beauty of the ordinary. It made us despise you, as everything too freely given, a dog's loyalty, a mother's love, God's mercy, is despised. It shined too bright our unbearable sin. We preferred the shattered line, the blank stare, the shaft of steel glinting in the hot sun. And what have you to show for it? All that quaint verse on hearth and home and faith and love. A legacy that chronicles defeat. A rest stop here, a mawkish bookmark there. See how a nation honors its fallen. See how Columbia mocks her laureate. And I have come through the wet, red forests of time to bear witness. We killed you. Or so I thought when my single bullet, precise, exact, direct, pierced your temple. But now you look at God all day, dead soldier, ora pro me. Thank you.